Hello and welcome to another motorcycling video. As you can see by the title of this one, it's about Australia Post and the Australia Post decision to go electric. Now, if you live outside Australia, I should explain that Australia Post is the government agency that is responsible for delivering the mail. That is the letters and parcels and things like that that people send to each other. They have a second business which is a parcel delivery and package delivery business. It's called trike. Not Star Trek, Star Trek. Probably since the introduction of the first email services in the late 80s and early 90s, the volume of letters that people in Australia have been sending to each other has been steadily decreasing. And so we send each other emails, we get our bills by email, or we use SMS or some other encrypted service on our phones to communicate with each other, and things like letters are rarities these days. Birthday and Christmas cards are not as common, so generally the volume of letters that people send to each other has been decreasing. And Australia Post, whereas once they used to deliver mail every day, they now do it twice a week. The Star Trek business uses large diesel trucks to deliver parcels and to move mail from large urban and metropolitan centres to smaller regional centres where it is then sorted and delivered. Since the 1970s, mail in Australia, letters and small parcels, has been delivered by combustion motorcycles. There have been two models of motorcycles that have been used consistently over that period. One is a step-through scooter, and you'll see some pictures of these at the end of this video. One of them is a step-through scooter called a 110 Cub, I believe. It looks like all the other step-through scooters of that time and has a sort of couple of leg shields around where the rider's legs would be, and looks like a bit of a fairing. It may be a twist-and-go transmission, I'm not sure, or it could be a manual transmission. Probably only has 3, maybe 4 gears at the most. At about a 110cc engine and probably maximum speed of about 80 kilometres an hour. The second bike was a Honda CT110, which became known as the Postie bike. It's a red bike, and you'll see it, as I said, in the pictures at the end of this video. And it became known as the Postie bike because they were the more common one, and the postmen, as they were in those days, but we'll just call them Posties from now on to not offend anybody's gender. But the Posties used to, they were the most common ones, and the Posties used to deliver the mail on those bikes. And in researching this, I found at one stage Australia Post's fleet of motorcycles was 5,000. Now, at some point, Australia Post decided that they would go green, or at least that they would examine their carbon footprint and see if there were ways to reduce the carbon footprint. Now, my guess would be that the CT110 and the Cub motor scooter probably cost something like $5,000 to purchase, register and put on the road. The CT110 originally was a farm bike and was not meant to be road legal, but through negotiations between Australia Post, Honda, the various federal and state motoring authorities, it was agreed that this bike could be registered and ridden on the road. It was classified as a motorcycle. The posties had to wear a helmet and had to have motorcycle licences, and at one stage I believe that Australia Post used to help prospective posties to get a motorcycle licence. They no longer do that for reasons that I'll come to in a moment. So the CT110 in particular became a road legal bike, and after it had reached the end of its life with Australia Post, which they said was about 3.5 years, they would be then sold at auction. So an auction house would buy a bunch of them and then auction them off, and so Australia Post would get some money back on the original purchase. But as I say, in about 2015, 2017, Australia Post decided to examine its carbon footprint and find ways to reduce its carbon footprint. It was no doubt, like everybody else, aware of all the issues around global warming and noxious emissions from all sorts of motorised transport, and decided it had a role to play and it would do its bit. it decided that how it would do its bit would be that it would get rid of the fleet of combustion motorcycles and scooters and replace them with a cleaner, greener option. And they progressively have been phasing them out till I think the last ones will probably go out of, the last of the combustion motorcycles will go out of use this year. They replace them with three options. One option is like a glorified shopping cart. It's not actually a metal shopping cart like you see in the supermarket, but it's something very similar to that. It has one wheel at the front, a handle and two wheels at the back, and the postie wheels this thing in front of themselves and walks up and down the street and delivers the mail. I've mainly seen it in the main street of Goulburn rather than on a suburban route. The second option was that they would buy, that is Australia Post would buy a bunch of e-bikes. They are bicycles with a small electric motor and a battery that's rechargeable, and a bit like what we call a moped in Australia, so that you pedal normally, but when you come to a steep hill or somewhere like that, or you're feeling a bit fatigued, you flick the switch and the engine comes on and helps you to get up the really steep incline or steep hill or whatever, and then when you get to the top and it's flat again or easy to pedal, you turn off the motor. Those bikes need to be plugged in and recharged on a regular basis, and my guesstimate would be that they are cost somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000. I imagine that the combustion motor scooters cost somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000 to put on the road, and as I said, that they were auctioned off through a motoring auction business at the end of their life. And I've just looked yesterday on Bike Sales, which is an online website for selling motorcycles, and I can see them going for anywhere between about $1,500 and $3,000. The third option that Australia Post went for was a fully electric trike sort of vehicle. And in speaking to, in casual conversation just with the posties around my town and the ones that I come across in Launceston, which is where I first saw these electric trikes, I was told that what happened was Australia Post entered into a competitive tender process where they asked an Australian company to work with them and try and design something along the lines of what they wanted, and they also worked with a Swiss company. Now, the Swiss company already had their machine in production. It's a three-wheeled trike, as I said, with one at the front, two at the back. There's a battery. I'm not sure what the chemical makeup that is, whether it's lithium ion or something else, and an electric motor, and all of that is behind the rider. And these bikes have a very high centre of gravity, and as I say, all the weight is behind the rider. So the Swiss company already had their vehicle in production, and apparently it was being used by the Swiss Post Office and also used in Germany by the Postal Delivery Service. The Australian company came up with a design which Australia Post wasn't happy with. I'm not sure what the reasons were, but they decided to go with the Swiss model, which, as I've said, has these two wheels at the back, one at the front. It's a fully electric vehicle which takes about 10 hours to recharge and is plugged in overnight. It is speed limited to 45 kilometres per hour and does not meet any Australian design rules, but is specifically registered only to Australia Post. And so these vehicles, I was told in casual conversation, as I say, with the postie, that they cost $20,000. Now, I have no way to verify that because I did some research and tried to find out via Australia Post web searches and Google searches and so on what the cost was, and the response I got was, unfortunately, it is not possible to give the cost of these bikes. So I'm going to accept that the $20,000 is the correct figure. On the one hand, it disappointed me that Australia Post were either unable or unwilling to work with the Australian manufacturer and get the machine, for want of a better word, the vehicle that they wanted made in Australia, creating jobs in Australia. I don't know whether the other machine is made in Switzerland or the company is in Switzerland but the vehicles are made in China or somewhere, but if we start with the assumption it was made in Switzerland, it's unlikely that labour costs and production costs in general would be any cheaper in Switzerland than they are in Australia, plus there would be the transportation costs of getting it to Australia. Now, as I said, these bikes are registered exclusively to Australia Post, and unlike the combustion Cub 110 and the CT 110, when those bikes reach the end of their life, which is 3 and a bit years for the combustion ones, and they're auctioned off, the registration is transferred to the new owner, and it's perfectly legal to ride them on the road. And in fact, there were groups of enthusiasts who used to buy these CT 110s that were called the postie bikes and conduct rallies where they'd load these bikes up with all their gear and ride around Australia on them. So they were a very popular bike. Cheap to run, economical to buy, especially if you bought one after Australia Post had used it, and you still probably got a few years life out of it for somewhere upwards, maybe at the most $3,000. You still got a few years life out of it, and it's ideal for somebody commuting in a city or to university or somewhere. The registration costs and insurance costs were very cheap, and Australia Post would have got some return on their initial outlay to buy their next fleet. Now, these electric trikes, as I say, I was told they cost $20,000, so that is possibly 3 or 4 times the cost of the combustion vehicle. They have a life of 7 years, so yes, you're getting double the life or thereabouts, but at the end of that 7-year period, they are not able to be purchased by members of the public. In other words, they can't be auctioned off. Individuals can't buy them and ride them on the road because they don't meet Australian design rules, and therefore they're not allowed to be registered for use by anybody else but Australia Post. So in talking to a postie recently, he told me they just sent them to be wrecked. Now that's probably well and good, with one exception. Yes, the tyres can be shredded and turned into that spongy soft material they put under playgrounds or use for athletics tracks and that sort of stuff. Yes, the steel that's in the chassis or the body or the frame can probably be melted down and recycled, and maybe even some of the electrical parts and the engine itself can be stripped down and recycled. But the biggest and most expensive item in these bikes is undoubtedly the battery, and the battery cannot or is not recycled. And looking at information from Australia Post, they tell me that they are working with the company, or their website says that they are when they adopted these bikes, that they are working with the company to enhance the recycling of the batteries. I would have thought they would have had, since they cannot on-sell them to someone else and make some money off them or recoup some of their costs, I would have thought they would have had an agreement with the manufacturer to say, well, when the bike is reached its use-by date in 7 years, you take it back and you recycle it, you work out what happens to the parts of it, you built it. In the meantime, you've got 7 years to work out how to recycle the battery, whether it's lithium ion or some other chemical. But obviously that's not going to happen. The bikes are going to stay in Australia, I assume, and end up in landfill, and the batteries are going to end up, well, nobody knows where. Well, I'm sure somebody does, but I'm unable to find out in my basic research, well, where does this battery go, and what happens to it? Now, there had been a lot of concern about potential fires caused by lithium-ion batteries, even the little batteries that power your drill and your, those Azito power tools you buy from Bunnings that all have interchangeable one battery that serves 5 or 6 different machines. Eventually the batteries cannot be recharged anymore and have to get thrown away, and they go in garbage trucks and cause fires, is what I've heard. So there's a problem here saying, well, we've gone green, or we've gone electric, but in the process we've paid 3 or 4 times more for the machine than we paid for the previous machine. It has double the life, but as I say, 3 or 4 times the initial outlay. And when the thing reaches the end of its life with us, then it just goes into landfill or to a wreckers, which is essentially landfill, and eventually, if the battery breaks down, the lithium ion or whatever else that is in it just leaks into the ground, into the soil, and ends up in the groundwater and ends up in the creeks and rivers and God knows whatever else. Now, to their credit, Australia Post have, according to their website and according to information that I read in researching this, have replaced some of their diesel trucks with electric trucks, and they have a program to replace more of them. And further to their credit, these electric bikes are not powered or recharged using coal-fired electricity or coal-fired power station created electricity. The major depots where they're stored, and I would assume that applies to a place like Goulburn where I am at the moment, where I live, have solar panels which allow for recharging and battery storage, which allow for these bikes to be restored using renewable energy. Now, there's some other considerations to do with these bikes that not necessarily to do with their environmental credentials, but to do with general safety and use of these bikes. Now, the step-through scooter and the postie bike, the CT110, both met Australian design rules and were allowed to be registered on the road. You had to wear a motorcycle helmet, you had to wear a helmet to ride them and have a motorcycle licence. In the ACT now, the government has changed the regulations and says that even though these things are a three-wheeled machine and would be classified as a motorcycle anywhere in Australia, it is not necessary to have a motorcycle licence to ride them. So that means that people who previously just had a car licence, they still have to wear a helmet for their own protection and because their employer says so, but they don't have to have a motorcycle licence. In looking at some websites to find out some information about them, about these bikes, I came across a forum where a number of people who claim to have ridden them had some comments to make about their safety. I should say at this stage that I haven't ridden one, and of course since they can't be bought by the public, it's never likely that I'm going to ride one. But looking at them, I can see that some of the concerns that the people expressed on this forum may well and truly be valid. The first one is that these bikes have no suspension. They have some springs under the seat and the tyres are rubber, but there's no suspension, forks, swing arm or springs or whatever that you'd find on an ordinary motorcycle. So given the state of roads in Australia, in suburban areas and footpaths that these guys, posties, ride on to deliver the mail, you can imagine that the ride is fairly uncomfortable. And one of the recurring comments was that these bikes are very uncomfortable because there is no suspension. And you can imagine going over speed bumps on the road and so on, that the jarring on the spine would be quite unpleasant. I have some general concerns about front wheel trikes, that is the one with the wheel at the front and single wheel at the front and two wheels at the back, in that in some circumstances, in high wind areas, which Goulburn is notorious for, it is possible for the front wheel to be lifted off the ground. And these bikes have a very short wheelbase, so maybe that is not the case. But I'm going to assume, given the rest of the structure of this bike, which is that there is a big tall box that sits behind the rider that contains the mail. It also undoubtedly contains the battery and the engine or the motor or whatever it is that drives this thing, that all the weight is at the back of the bike, and that creates, at least in my mind, a recipe for instability. A second issue that was brought to mind in regard to safety was that because of their design, and you'll see this in the pictures at the end of the video, they have a very high centre of gravity, and so if you turn them too sharply, they're inclined to tip over. Now you think, well, why would you turn them too sharply? Well, if you were riding along the footpath and a dog, for example, ran out of a yard and ran towards you, as dogs are inclined to do with posties, then and you want to swerve to avoid the dog, there's a tendency for the bike to tip over. The rider, okay, is protected by a helmet, and there's a bit of a sort of roll cage, if you like, of the frame around the bike. Obviously the rider doesn't wear a seatbelt, so once the bike tips over, although his head or their head is protected by a helmet, there's potential for them to be injured, and I would imagine that these bikes are fairly heavy to get up and right again. I wouldn't want to guess at what they weigh, but I would imagine a couple of 100 kilos So to put it back up on its 3 wheels and right it to ride again would be, I think, something of a challenge. Now, according to Australia Post, they have telematics. I'm not sure what that is, but they say they have telematics in these bikes that allow the posties to connect with their base if they're being harassed or threatened or attacked or whatever. So I guess there's some sort of alarm that goes off if the bike tips over, or the rider can activate an alarm, and I don't know whether then somebody's sent out to help them right it, or an ambulance is sent. I'm not sure, doesn't say what the process is, but there is an alarm of some sort that can be activated, and the depot where the rider comes from can be notified that there's been an accident or there's a problem, and hopefully someone comes to their help. Because they are speed limited to 45 kilometres an hour, okay, in most urban areas this maximum speed limit is 50 kilometres an hour, so they probably could keep up with the traffic in most circumstances, but nevertheless people are going to be impatient with them, and they've clearly posted on the back of them that they are speed limited to 45 kilometres an hour. And so if you are behind one and you're wanting to do the 50 kilometres an hour, you're going to be impatient about wanting to get past this person on this postie bike, and the postie bike person can't go any faster because the bike is limited to that. There may be nowhere for them to pull over because it's a narrow suburban street. There's no shoulder, there's no second lane for them to pull over into. And so you're going to be getting frustrated being behind them, and they're going to get frustrated because they know that you're behind them and they know that you're tailgating them, and they can't do anything about either of those matters. It's just a matter of putting up with it. So overall, Australia Post has made a decision to go electric and go green. I'm not sure how much consultation there was with the actual people who ride these machines before they were introduced, how many trial runs they had with them, and how much honest feedback was sought from the posties on the ground who ride them and deliver them, or deliver the mail from them. But again, I'm not sure that the decision is the wisest one in terms of value for money and in terms of what happens with these machines when they reach the end of their life. So those are my thoughts on Australia Post goes electric. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the commentary, and if not, that you enjoyed the scenery. And as I said at the end of this video, there will be some pictures that will show you the sorts of bikes that I'm talking about: the step-through scooter, the red CT110 postie bike, and the new electric bikes that Australia Post are now using. Again, thank you for watching, and I'll catch up with you in the next video.